Hello, art historians. Today we're going to be working on our next three pieces in our Egyptian history. So when last we left off, we were still in the Old Kingdom. We were doing the pyramids. And the three pyramids, Khufu, Khafre, and Menkaura, or Menkaure, depending on who is saying it. So here's King Menkaura and his queen, and her name is, it's all of those jumble of letters, but it's pronounced Khmer-Mebti. So King Menkaura and Queen Khmer-Mebti, he was the pharaoh. The pharaoh that had the smallest of the three pyramids at the Great Pyramids in Giza. So here we see our favorite, one of our favorite Egyptian materials, which is greywack, which is that really hard gray sandstone. And it's really important that when we're looking at this, we're thinking about the way that it contrasts with the seated scribe, because the seated scribe shows us depictions of common people, and this shows us what is considered the appropriate depiction of royalty, of the pharaoh and his queen. And it's a very different set of rules that governs what that is supposed to look like. And the rules that govern what that's supposed to look like is called the canon of proportions. Canon, meaning a group of accepted ideas, and proportions, the proportions of your body. And for the Egyptians, the canon of proportions was actually an exact mathematical measurement for the depiction of the human form, how, what the ratio of the head to the rest of the body, and how, the ratio of where the eyes and the nose and the mouth sit in the face. Sorry, it's still Monday here. And so what we're seeing is this depiction of the human form as it is seen for pharaohs and their spouses. And so it's a very rigid set of rules that results in a very rigid depiction of the human body. And that is because they are following particular conventions. And so the first thing that we see is Menkaura with his foot forward. And that is frequently how rulers are depicted in this time period. Think for a second why that foot would be forward. And if you came up with, because they're moving the country forward, they're helping the nation move forward, they're going in the right direction, it's all sort of like that. You will see that Khmer-Mebti's foot is also forward, not as far as his, but you will see that is how she looks as well. It's that progress, it's that leadership, it's that, that whole concept of what we want our rulers to look like and what we want them to be doing. As we examine this, we're going to notice a couple of other things. This is the ideal form for Egyptians, okay? This is what they see their ideal ruler as. You can see that Menkaura has is musculature. He has a lot of defined musculature. He's very physically fit. You see that Khmer-Mebti has, her breasts are very clear. She has this little bump of a stomach, which hints at the possibility of fertility. Her clothes are very tight. They cling to her in order to, enhance or emphasize her femininity. But look at the position of their arms. His arms are very straight. His body is, his arms are very close to his body. Her arms are very close to her body. And this is originally, statues are originally constructed like this to avoid breakage. Think about the Venus de Milo. She's missing both of her arms. Think about some of the other famous sculptures from antiquity. And the second that you have those pieces of arms, legs hanging out into open space, the more likely they are to be broken, which is why the sarcophagus of the spouses is such a big deal, because that is like occupying that three-dimensional space. But her arms are tucked tight to her body in the front, and around the back of him, she brings her arm around him and is holding him in a way that is her body is meant to be affectionate. She is slightly protective of him. But the reason that her arm is behind him, she is presenting him to the gods. This is our king and our god king. We realize when we look at this that her arms could definitely not do that. That it's just not anatomically correct for her arm that is behind him to be that long. And so we get back to this is ideal forms, and Egyptian forms are not anatomically correct. They are more in line with the ideal, what they want to present. Menkaura's hands are his hands are balled up. He is exemplifying strength. You see that he has that long beard that is indicative of a pharaoh, and that headdress. And the headdress is meant to look like the sun, because remember, he is the son of the sun. That is what pharaohs are considered to be. You're dealing with Ra as the sun god, and that pharaohs are divinely chosen by Ra to lead. And so he has the headdress of the sun to remind you that he is divinely chosen by the sun gods. The same way that we see Hammurabi showing that he got his divine right from Shamash. Here we see Menkaura emphasizing that he got his divine right from Ra. This is a funerary statue. It would have been, or it would have been connected to his funerary complex, the small buildings in front, and then the larger pyramid. We have to remember that what we see with these is they're very stylized. They're not meant to look too human, and because we have to remember that they're partially God. And so when we think about this one and we think about the seated scribe, that explains to us that canon of proportions. The canon of proportions was different for real people versus god kings and queens. And so this is really that you can see it, the visual representation of divine right. And so I'm going to zoom to the next, I'm going to click to the next slide and show you some of the details. Look at how their legs are attached to that column in the back. That adds stability, it adds permanence, because remember, these gods want to have their ka and their legacy last for eternity. And so they want their statues to last as long as possible. And they were able to figure out that, those arms into the third dimension, they're out, three-dimensional, meant that things broke. And so they avoided that as much as possible. Okay, so we're going to move on to your theme there, depiction of royalty. And remember, we've already talked about how this is, you can talk about how this is, when you talk about similar to, you could talk about this and the seated scribe, and that they're both built in the canon of proportions. Just one is built for humans, and one was built for divine gods and the pharaohs. All right, here we go. The next one, you have 3 images. Here, I'm going to show you your images first. It's this huge temple complex. The second one is this floor plan. And the third one is, excuse me, I have allergies. No, I guess, are there just 2? Oh, I'm sorry. And this one right here. I missed that star there. I told you it's Monday. And so the huge complex, just one of the columns that's present in this area right here. This column here that you see is from this area right here. Okay, and then the third one is the floor plan. And you can see all of these columns here. All right, So this is the temple of Amun-Re and hypostyle hall. And we talked about a hypostyle hall when we did the Apadana of Darius and Xerxes. And a hypostyle hall is any large space that is completely filled with columns in order to hold up the ceiling. And so we're looking at this huge complex. It's at Karnak, that's the city that it's in, and which is near Luxor. And this is New Kingdom. So now we've moved into the New Kingdom. You actually don't have anything from the Middle Kingdom, so that's kind of nice. You have Old Kingdom and New Kingdom. Okay, and so what you're looking at is the temple was constructed and like sort of this part back here, right? This various parts of the temple were constructed in 1550. And then like this is the temple area. And then the hypostyle hall, this area here, was constructed around 1250. And it's all made of, sandstone and mud brick. And what I want to do is I actually want to switch to the next slide really quickly so that you can see this. And what you see on this slide is really an important identification of what is taking place here. This is what you see is a continuation of this building. You can see that there are pieces that were built at the early part, at that 1500. And then you look down here and you see that there are pieces that were built 1500 and then 14 and then 1375. You see large scale building by Ramses in some of these areas. This dark area here was by Ramses II, who is called the Builder King. And so you see, look at this area here, this whole outside section and all of the columns in this hypostyle hall. And so what you're able to identify is that this is a building that continued to change shape and change dimension over large periods of time. So when we're thinking about this, we have to think first about sort of what this area was used for, what the temple was used for, and its whole purpose. And when we look at it, I want you to just, I'm going to scroll forward and I'm going to show you some reconstruction pieces so you have a better idea of what it would look like. It's very hard to visualize this. And so I'm going to scroll forward. I want you to think about how big this is. Just the temple of Amun-Ra was 61 acres. And then the whole complex is 248 acres. And I like to use houses, off of Sweepstakes and Preakness. Those are both on about those roughly are like a quarter to a half an acre maybe. So do your math there about how many 120 houses, if we're on half acre lots, the ones that have smaller yards, you're taking 250-ish houses to make up just the temple, not to include the whole mortuary complex. So let's look at this. What you're looking at, this is that hypostyle hall. It's all of these columns that then have a roof built over top of them, and it makes this huge hall of columns. It reminds us of the Apadana. So this is what we really need to think of. This is Luxor. This is, like where a lot of the kings are. Then you come up the Nile, and this is called the Avenue of the Sphinxes. And you come to this temple at Karnak. And I'm going to talk to you on this page a little bit about what this was used for. All right. So Amun-Re was like sort of a connection of the god Amun and the god Re, and they sort of blended together and became Amun-Re, which is basically the sun. Okay, he was a major important god. And so what you have here is he was married, Amun-Re was married to Mut, M-U-T, and annually, excuse me, there would be a festival that would reenact the wedding of Amun-Re and Mut. And they would sail up the Nile and bring these giant statues of Amun-Re and Mut to the temple at Karnak, and up they'd come up the Nile, they'd enter here at Luxor, and then they would go up the Avenue of the Sphinxes, which was literally a road with sphinxes pointing in on both sides. And they would put the statues of Amun-Re and Mut into the temple at Karnak as a way to remind the people of the importance of the god Amun-Re, and as a way for the king to remind everyone, like, look, this is the god, this is his wife, and they chose me to be your king. And so it's really important that we remember that this whole temple complex is a way to connect the gods to the pharaoh to divine rule. And by having this festival annually, it was a way to think about, or to remind the people of the importance of the gods. And this festival usually took place at the time of the year where the Nile was flooding its banks and delivering the silt. And so what that meant was, and it's super cool, but what that meant was, it was a way also to remind people that the gods are the ones that allow the Nile to flood annually, to provide for all of that growth of crops, to provide for our food surplus that then allows us to be this hugely profitable and amazing civilization. So as the statue of Amun-Re and Mut go up the causeway, and then they spend the night in the temple, and then they would return at the end back to their original place. It was a concept that was begun by Seti the First. And so I'm going to switch back one more time and show you this. So Seti the First, right here in 1280, he's the one that decides that we need to have this whole like show. The part of the building was here. He's the one that starts the ramping up of the complex and the remodeling of the complex. And then Ramses II, his son, really builds it into this amazingly, hugely popular, gigantic thing. And like I said before, Ramses is known as being the builder king. He built everything, Ramses II. So this is considered one of the largest ancient religious sites in the world. And like I said, and that's because with each king, with each pharaoh, there would be more of the building added to, more and more and more, remodelings and additions, and even inside what was originally part of this, this hall. That's when Ramses II adds all of the columns, and it becomes a hypostyle hall. And all of these columns talk about all of the hieroglyphics on the columns talk about how amazing Ramses II is. So it's a little bit propaganda as well. So what's interesting, though, about the temples of ancient Egypt is there was a point where the people could come in and sort of worship here, but once you entered into this doorway here and back into the inner reaches of the temple, it was only for like the super wealthy could come in here with royalty and the priests, but then those super wealthy that were sort of like guests would have to stay in this area here. The common people were not even allowed in the temple. Guests of the pharaoh and stuff like that could come in here. Once you entered this area, it was only for the royal family and the priests. And so this becomes this what they call the inner sanctum of the religion. And so, what happens here is Ramses II wants to make sure that as the priests are walking through here, they remember that they might be able to talk to the gods, but Ramses wants them to remember that he is actually chosen by the gods. Because there becomes, anytime that you're in a theocracy, there's always this sort of battle between the ruler and the priestly class, the religious class, because the religious class says we are able to, commune with the gods. And the ruler is like, yeah, but I was chosen by the gods. And there's often a sort of a competition between the two of them. And so Ramses really adds to this huge hypostyle hall here so that all of these columns talk about how amazing Ramses II is. And so the priests come through here and see all of this sort of propaganda about how amazing he is. And then they walk into this further area that Ramses continued to build up. And it's a way for Ramses to sort of be able to say, hey, look, don't forget that you might be the priest, but I'm the one that's really in charge. And this hypostyle hall that Ramses II builds here remains the largest hypostyle hall in the ancient world. And the only reason that it loses, the only reason that Persepolis doesn't get that thing is that most of Persepolis is gone. The majority of this hypostyle hall is still intact. So we're going to scroll forward and look at these pictures here, and I'm going to talk about a couple of things. The Egyptians invented this really cool thing, and you're going to write this down, Clerestory. It's called clerestory. And clerestory is any opening at the top of a building that allows light in. And what's interesting about the hypostyle hall is if the Egyptians hadn't put these little windows in here that allowed light in, the entire thing, the whole hypostyle hall would have just been dark and impossible to see anything in it. But the clerestory, which we see here in ancient Egypt, but we'll also see in Greece, and then we'll see again in Rome, and then we'll see again in Romanesque cathedrals, and then we'll definitely see them in Gothic cathedrals. I mean, the clerestory becomes a major architectural what is the word I want? An architectural component. Sorry about that. And so the clerestory allows light to come into this hypostyle hall, and the columns would have been brightly, wildly painted. And so the light comes in through these little windows here and throws light onto the columns so that you can actually read them. And so that's a really important thing. And the Egyptians invented these clerestory windows. And so we have to remember that the Egyptians did everything they could to make sure that their history was preserved. And so these huge complexes with all of these hieroglyphics help to tell the story. So when you have just this thing here, it's called a column. And then the part at the top is called the capital. And the capital is where the column attaches to the roof. And you have two different kinds of columns. You have these ones that sort of open out, and those are called papyrus capitals because they look like a papyrus flower. And this is called a bud capital because it looks like the bud of a flower that hasn't opened yet. So these are Egyptian columns. And then there's a whole another set of Greek columns, and then a whole nother set of Roman columns. But what you see here is just a campaign to create really impressive stuff. And then this construction sort of leads us into the next Egyptian piece, which is literally my favorite Egyptian piece of all time. And this is the mortuary temple of Hatshepsut. And so this is New Kingdom. And what you're going to see is this is what takes the place of pyramids. And then they get tired of doing this and they go to the Valley of the Kings, which I will talk about a little bit later. But this, instead of building up, it builds long and in. And so we have a lot to talk about with this piece. And the first thing we're going to talk about is mortuary temple of Hatshepsut. Hatshepsut was a woman. Her father was Thutmose I. Her brother was Thutmose II. And she marries Thutmose II, her brother. And that is not unusual in ancient Egypt for a brother and sister to marry because they believed that would keep the royal line pure. Now, Thutmose III, who becomes king after her, Thutmose III is the child of her brother Thutmose II and his other wife, his minor wife. So what we see here is their father, Thutmose II, and Hatshepsut. Their father was Thutmose I. He was like a really cool guy. I'm going to scroll back a little bit and show you like here's Thutmose I, right? So he built some of the stuff. So then their father, Thutmose I, dies, and she marries her brother Thutmose II. And they never have children. But Thutmose II has children with his minor wife. And so in the time between when Thutmose II, her brother, husband, dies, and Thutmose III is old enough to rule, Hatshepsut becomes the ruler of Egypt. What's interesting about that is she rules from 1479 BCE to 1458 BCE. And so what you see here is this begins to be carved in 1473 when she begins her rule, and it's finished in 1458 when her rule ends. So they were building this mortuary temple for her during her entire reign. And she serves as sort of like a placeholder, as a regent. There are lots of different words for it, where this person sort of serves as king or serves as pharaoh until the actual king is old enough. The interesting thing, though, is that Hatshepsut is a woman. And there is no word in Egyptian for female king or female ruler or female pharaoh. There isn't a word for it. So she just becomes king. They don't call her queen because queen means the wife of the king, but she's not the wife of the king. She becomes the king. So it's an interesting thing about what happens with her, because Egyptian is a very visual language. Think about all your hieroglyphics. There is no word for a female king. And so she's just called king, and that's really neat. And I really like that. So we see that this is near Luxor, New Kingdom, 18th dynasty. It's sandstone, and it's partially carved into the rock cliff. So you can see that the cliff is here, and then it is carved into the cliff and goes back into the area underneath these huge rocks. It's hollowed out, and it continues back into the rock face. It's a beautiful, huge space. And I'm going to show you another image really quick. It's more of an aerial image. So here you get the ramp and then an open area and then another ramp and then into this portion. And then there's the doorways into the actual entrance. It's huge. And so I think I have one more. This is what I want. So Hatshepsut has this really cool entrance here. When you come from entering the temple, you would enter way down here on this avenue of the Sphinxes. That would lead you all the way back to the Temple of Karnak. And you would come up this avenue of Sphinxes, which is different from the other one that I showed you before. And you'd come up this spot, and then there was like this open area, right? And there were all of these ramps, and she included in this area, this is her actual temple here, all of this area here. She had built a chapel to Hathor, who's that cow goddess that we see on the palette of Narmer. And there is the inclusion here of a temple for her stepson, who becomes King Thutmose III. So they share this whole complex, which is kind of cool. And so what I want to show you, though, is I'm going to scroll back this way. That is how it's supposed to go. So look at what it says there, architect, Senamut. So here's the interesting thing. After Thutmose II dies, she has a long-term relationship with this architect, Senamut. So not only was he the royal architect, but he also becomes her lover, her companion through the rest of her reign. And so it's just really, really cool because he builds this for her. And as he builds this for her, inside the temple, here in this, I'm going to scroll again, in this little area here, there's lots of interesting little stories that are told here, the birth colonnade. And what happens here in the birth colonnade is all of the hieroglyphics that are on all of these columns and this birth colonnade right here, they all make up a story of her divine birth. Because remember, she's a pharaoh. She has to have divine birth. So they make this story. He writes this story on the columns that she is actually the child of Amun herself. She is a child of Amun, not just Thutmose, but her as well. And then there are all these myths that are written on this birth colonnade and then the Punt colonnade, just to sort of tell her history so that they can convey her authority and make sure that everybody understands that she is super important. So what you see is these are statues that welcome you into the temple. These are statues of Hatshepsut, but standing as a pharaoh, and her face is clearly very feminine. This is a one of the sphinxes of Hatshepsut. Again, a very feminine face. Because she is a woman, they depict that here. But also, she's pharaoh, so they give her the headdress and beard of Ra. And so it's a very cool thing. Now, remember here, as we're looking at this one, that Thutmose III is her stepson. And she rules until Thutmose III is old enough to rule. And then he takes over and she dies. And when she dies, Thutmose III goes into her temple, and I'm going to go this way, and takes off most of the statues of her here, and here, breaks most of the sphinxes that were there. And he goes in, well, not he, but he has people go in to most of the mortuary temple and erase her name. Because the Egyptians believed that if your name was erased in this life, that you would be erased in the afterlife. Now, what's interesting, though, is he doesn't have people go back into this back section of the mortuary temple and erase her name. Her name is left intact here. It's erased in all of this front stuff and all of these sphinxes and in this chapel of Hathor, but not back here in the inner part of the temple. And that's important. He has to identify himself. He has to make clear that he is the pharaoh. And because Hatshepsut is still alive, he has to assert his dominance over her. And so he does that by destroying a good portion of her temple and the depictions of her and her name. But he doesn't destroy her name back here in the inside of the temple. And the reason for that is, if he had removed all of her names, he would have destroyed her ka. Remember that thing that we have to preserve, that spirit. He would have destroyed her ka if he had destroyed all of her names. And then she would never have been able to move to the afterlife. He would have destroyed her in the afterlife. That would have been it. So she was kind of like his stepmother. She was the person who taught him how to be pharaoh, because she was pharaoh and he was learning from her. And so he politically has to say, okay, now I'm like 20 and I'm ready to be pharaoh. You got to stop being pharaoh. So I'm going to make it look like I'm trying to erase you, but I'm not actually trying to erase you. And so he doesn't destroy everything. And he leaves some of it, intact. And what's also excellent is, when she dies, her body is not actually interred here in the temple. Her body was interred elsewhere, probably by Senenmut, because while most people could figure out that what Thutmose III was doing was sort of political, Senenmut was afraid that someone would defile her mummy. And if you defile a mummy, the body needs to be kept intact and the ka needs to be kept intact. And if either of those don't work, then you die in the afterlife. And so the belief is that Senenmut buried her elsewhere in order to preserve her immortality in the afterlife. But look at this beautiful complex. There were trees, there were sphinxes, there were statues of her as pharaoh, there were all of these columns, there were some obelisks, which are a really tall, pointy thing, like the Washington Monument is an obelisk. And so it's a really beautiful setting. One of the other images that you have for the Temple of Hatshepsut, you have this one, but your second image is this. And this is really cool. It's a guardian figure, so kind of like the Lamassu. And you can see that this was broken because, in his attempt to assert his dominance, they break all of her, pictures of her. So this is really important when you look at this. I think that what you see with her temple, long and thin and beautiful, it's very elegant. And her showing of her power is also very elegant. So there were more than 200 sculptures of her. Most of them were broken, and most of them have been put back together. And there are 10 of her kneeling. And remember, when you think about this, she's divinely chosen by the gods, and the only time a divinely chosen pharaoh would ever kneel would be in front of the actual god. So these were from inside the temple, and the kneeling statues of Hatshepsut, these are votives. Okay, just kind of like our old votives, right? So these would have been filled with offerings and plants and oils and spices, offerings to Amun, and they would have been back in that interior portion of the temple. And so she would have been kneeling in front of Amun to offer him these things. So many of these are so cool because it unlike the rest of the beards that you see, her beard is slightly different. And archaeologists believe that it is to make clear that she's not actually a man. She's has this false beard, and her face is much rounder. She has there's a hint of breast there. Her dimensions are just different, and they're really, really beautiful. She has some male attributes, but there's also female attributes still seen there. And it's really, really an important sculptural, what we call a sculptural campaign. The whole sculpture, all of them they're just a wonderful way to show who she was, that she was the woman king. And Hatshepsut was really cool. And she kind of got, done dirty by Thutmose when he became pharaoh. But luckily, in their belief system, he did not kill her Ka. He allowed her to have immortality because he left her name and her mummy intact. So that's what we did today. Menkaura, and then Amun-Re, the temple of Amun-Re, and then the mortuary temple of Hatshepsut. And so we have 3 more images, and I'll see you next time to finish up our study of Egypt. Have a good day.